Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, dear friends and colleagues. My name is Bobo Lowe, and I have the honor and great pleasure to moderate a discussion on one of the most critical issues in international relations today. And I would say the issue that has perhaps most dominated this year's Leonard Merry Conference. And that issue is China's role in the world and its implications for the West. To discuss this subject, we have a truly excellent panel. On my immediate left is Professor Cheng, Assistant Dean at the School of International Relations and Public Affairs at Shanghai International Studies University. To his left is Dr. Tori Taussig, Robert Bosch Foundation Fellow with the Brookings Institution. To her left is Dean Cheng, Senior Research Fellow at the Heritage Foundation in Washington. And finally, we have Teresa Fallon, Director of the Center for Russia, Europe, and Asia Studies in Brussels. Ladies and gentlemen, we are living through an extraordinary period of global transformation in which the very nature of world order is in question. And the single greatest catalyst of this transformation is the extraordinary rise of China. But if that much is obvious, then how the world, and the West in particular, responds to this challenge is anything but clear. We throw around terms like engagement and rules-based international order, but with little real idea, I would argue, of what they mean. What do these terms mean? And in the meantime, China's relations with the West are more problematic than at any time since Tiananmen 30 years ago. Retired US generals speak of a coming war between the United States and China. The EU describes China as a systemic rival, a strategic competitor. And at this very conference, German Defense Minister von der Leyen spoke of the creeping menace of China, compared far more threatening, a formidable adversary than a noisy Russia. And Xi Jinping's Belt and Road Initiative has crystallized and reinforced these tensions. So I want to begin our debate by putting three sets of questions to our distinguished panelists and to you in the audience. First, what does Beijing want in terms of an international order? Does it want global primacy, a G2 plus arrangement with the United States, a concert of great powers, otherwise known as the multipolar order? Or does it want simply a more equitable arrangement of the international system, reflecting China's increased influence and status? What would be the components, the principles underlying a possible post-American, post-liberal order? Second question for you. What challenges does the rise of China pose to the United States and Europe? Is it the existential threat that it is often portrayed as, especially in America, or does the real problem lie not with China or Russia, but actually with us? In other words, is blaming China an easy option to escape responsibility for our own failings, our own shortcomings in the West? In particular, an often casual disregard for the principles of the so-called rules-based international order. And my third question to you and to the panelists is how exactly should the West respond to the China challenge? Has the policy of engagement with China run its course? Has it definitively failed, as many claim? Or did we always expect too much from this? And if engagement has failed, then what are the alternatives? Where do we go from here? So Cheng, why don't you set the ball rolling and give us your views on some of these questions and anything that... You can sit down or you can stand up.
Okay, I think the first question is about China's attitude towards the future of the world order. So it's fully related to me, I think, maybe. As John Ikenberry said once, that the liberal international order primarily is internal order between the United States and its allies during the Cold War period. So at this time, China is not a full member of this so-called liberal international order, but it's partially, it also entered into this kind of international liberal international order because we have established a quasi-alliance relationship with the United States since 1972 to against the Soviet Union's growing influence in the world. So I mean, at the time even, China is a peripheral actor in the international system led by the United States. So in this way, I would like to say that China is a part of international order. But when Chinese leaders is talking about, Chinese leaders are talking about the international order, this international order is not necessarily the same with the liberal international order. Mm-hmm. It refers primarily to the critical functions of so-called core international institutions like the United Nations and its facilities. Maybe it is overlapping with the liberal international order, but that's not the same, mean the same. I mean, this is the first point. Second is, I would like to say, China is transforming from a regional power to a global power only recently. That means China is still in the learning and adapting to by itself and also to the expectations to the outside world, how to deal with all of the global governance and regional governance issues. China has no experience because since 40 years after the Opium War, actually China lost its primary status not only in the Northeast Asia, but in the whole global arena. So that means China has, long as one of Chinese songs says, you have never been, you have for a long time ever been a big brother. That means you forgot about how to act as this kind of big brother. I think it's very suited for today's China's status. So that means it takes much more time for us to adapt to the new reality, maybe also for the outside world. I remember when Friday evening when we went to the official dinner and by bus. When I entered into the bus, I sit finally out of my seat, and I was lonely at the time. My feeling is because nobody was asking me, but everyone was talking about China.
We talked for a long time.
Yeah, no, on the bus,
Okay.
So that means it's very similar to the China's position now. Everyone is worrying about China's rights, but nobody is good direct to ask for what China wants from this kind of
Is China on the bus?
China is on the bus, I think. And we would like to encourage all of the participants of the international community to also join us in the bus to a more cooperative world. And I would like to say the same, it's almost the same. For example, I think everything lies in the perception and misperception issues. Yeah. China is more like a passenger who sits in the high-speed train, and it feels itself by itself is quite comfortable, very good, But the outside world, especially in the West, the United States and its allies, are like the passengers standing in the platform to waiting for their high-speed train. But the Chinese train doesn't stop, at the station. And what are you feeling? You think that it's like a storm, it's quite noisy. So we think that we are like a Winnie, we are not like a little prince, like the French, but you think that we are King Kong, So it's China's rises so rapidly that it created a lot of troubles or perceptions of each side. China also, to some extent, I think China's lack of quite high qualified experts to explain, to interpret China's position to the world. So there are a lot of this kind of misperceptions, and I hope that we can deal with this kind of misperception through learning from each other.
Okay.
Yeah.
But you say that the West misperceives China, is ignorant about China. But isn't part of the problem that Chinese themselves
Just,
are not clear about what they want, what they expect of a world order. So if I put you on the spot,
Yeah.
what do you think China wants, or what should China want from a world order?
I think the first is only preliminary, ideas. I think the first is the future international order should not even not international. It should be a global order.
Right.
Global order with its inclusiveness, with its originalness, it's not necessarily as currently in a very narrow sense that the only liberal international, but a global order. The first. The second is, I think, this order should be new global order should be based on the principles of so-called joint consultation, joint maybe co-development or co-construction, and also sharing of the some common visions or joint, shared interests and also shared responsibilities is quite important. That means that everyone, including China, including the United States and Russia and other middle-sized and small countries, we are all in the same boat. We're all in the same boat, especially in a quite, in a world, as you meant, your term is in a world of disorder. We should cooperate with each other.
Right.
Third point is that I think this new global order, maybe must be based on the principle of multilateralism. According to me personally, and also I think according to many of Chinese scholars, that there is no pure, bilateral relationship.
Okay.
The multilateral relations is the trilateral relationship is the smallest unit for the international analysis, I think.
Okay, but do you mean multilateral or multipolar?
Multilateral, not multipolar.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
In this way, to some extent, maybe I'm not very in 100% agree with the so-called multipolarity, of global order, because multipolarity reminds me like the concert of great powers, remind me of the history of the 19th century.
Yeah.
It's only to find some consensus among great powers, but maybe we will forget about the voices and the interests of the smaller, even middle-sized countries.
Yeah.
We think that all countries, including great powers or middle-sized or small countries, should have the same rights to formulate the new global power. This is quite important.
I'm going to switch to Tori. Yang Cheng spoke about, in a way, co-governance. But that raises the obvious question of co-governance on the basis of what principles, what institutions. How do you see this evolving?
Well, first, I just want to take a moment to thank Leonard Mari for having me. This is my second time here. And last time and this time, I always arrive and leave with a sense of optimism, even as difficult as the conversations may be. And I think that's because of the people in the room. I think this is a fantastic panel. I'm happy to be a part of it. And Bobo, I think you're quoted more in my dissertation than any other scholar. So it's great to have this conversation with you as well. I want to follow up on Professor Yang's remarks, but also touch on some of these earlier questions that you brought up. And I thought, kind of to set the context, what I would do is bring up three primary drivers for why I think this moment in China's challenges to world order, China's challenges to the West have become so acute, have this feeling of acuteness. And I think it kind of brings together some of the themes that we've had over these last few days as well. And the first driver I see of this acute feeling of the China challenge actually has very little to do with China. I work in democracy studies, and in my own work on democracy in the West, it seems that over the last decade, since the global financial crisis, we in the West have been undergoing something of a crisis of confidence, in which our own citizens feel that the social contract between governments and citizens has not been upheld, that broad-based prosperity cannot be delivered successfully, effectively by democratic capitalist societies in the ways that we may have thought they went hand in hand in the 90s and early 2000s. And so I think over this decade, this perception, but very real feeling of liberal democratic backsliding and consternation in our own social and economic and political fabrics has led us to this feeling of being left behind. And this brings in China, but it's not driven by China.
Yeah.
The second factor has a lot to do with China. And this is that over the last decade, while the West has been undergoing this kind of crisis of confidence, China, of course, has not been standing still, both internationally and internally. But both of these international and domestic trends, kind of assertive power plays regionally and increasing authoritarianism, I would say, at home, have also become more acute in the last few years. One, with kind of this new notion of the Belt Road Initiative announced in 2013, but now reaches into the heart of Europe. That's viscerally felt here. And then also domestically, China is an authoritarian state. We've known this for a long time. I think perceptions that it would move in a democratic direction have not been felt for a long time. However, I think Xi Jinping's decision to consolidate control in 2017 at the 19th Party Congress, the decision not to anoint a successor, to kind of forego with the rules of traditional successorship, have caused a lot of concerns in the West. In interviews I do with German policymakers, I'm based in Berlin now, this did raise a lot of questions about future stability in China, but also the fact that this type of control is being driven now by AI-enhanced powers of monitoring that monitor citizens every step. I think it's led to a lot of questions in the West, coupled with this international drive of what could a Chinese leadership of this world mean if it looks like the kind of leadership of the CCP over its own people? And so I think that's a question that we're dealing with in the West in ways we haven't before. And the third reason, very briefly, that I don't think is lost on anyone is the shift in strategy coming out of Washington. And today, I think it's fair to say that we are in a holistic, comprehensive, multifaceted US-China competition that goes across aspects of the relationship. It's, of course, military, it's political, it's economic, technological, and in part ideological. And this has been felt for a number of years now. However, it's been ramped into high speed by the Trump administration. The entire foreign policy establishment operates in this framework of great power competition, at which I would say China is at the center. And President Trump and the Trump administration has been willing to pursue unilateral trade wars with China, has carried out a full diplomatic push on its European allies to try to ban Huawei from 5G networks, and I think is pursuing a far more unilateral and assertive strategy that makes it very clear that not only is this policy of engagement over, but that the United States is looking to push back on China in all facets of this relationship. And across all three of these drivers, within the West, coming from China and coming from Washington, Europe is not immune. And I think we're grappling with these strategic drivers today more so than we have at any point in modern history.
But there are a lot of authoritarian regimes around the world. One of the United States' closest allies is Saudi Arabia. Some of the Saudi behavior has been beyond belief, frankly. So why do we care about what the Chinese do in their own country? I understand the link between domestic factors and foreign policy, yes. But why do we apply a very different standard to China than we do with US allies? Are we not guilty of a certain double standards here? And basically we say allies, right or wrong, it doesn't really, we don't care about their domestic system, but oh no, China, you're a rival, therefore we do care. We make it our business to worry about increasing authoritarianism. What the Chinese would say, well, what business is it of yours?
Well, I actually think just to push back on that conception a little, I mean, for example, in the US-China trade talks, this notion of Xinjiang hasn't really come up and it has not been pushed forward by the United States. I mean, I could give personal views on what I think of the US-Saudi relationship or long-standing trends of US relations with authoritarian systems. But I think the more important question is that China is a rising power. It is a global power. It is in every economy across Europe, across the West. I don't think that there is this global drive to spread authoritarianism. I know that kind of rings true in certain parts of Washington, but again, it comes back to this question that I've heard people asking in Europe, in Berlin, that if we're seeing this domestic consolidation, these AI-powered technologies, these moves for monitoring and censoring, what does this mean for how China's role will evolve in the world? And I think right now it's a question, but it's an uncertainty that's leading Western economies, Western powers to assess their relations with China, not just in an economic way, but also in a strategic and values-based way.
But why not focus on stuff that's relatively concrete and tangible? So you have specific problems with, say, the forced transfer of technology. Focus on that, rather than, oh gosh, Xi Jinping has abolished term limits. I just wonder whether Western policy, with such a big target to aim at in China, actually sometimes misses stuff that it could change or it could influence, and is focused on sort of broader philosophical, ideological, ideational targets.
I actually wouldn't characterize US or European policy toward China in that way. Again,
Right.
This is a multifaceted debate, and there are
Sure.
certain
Yeah.
corners of the debate that I think focus on the ideological or authoritarian
Yeah.
challenges
Yeah.
more. But if you look at, for example, the new EU strategy on China, this focuses heavily on rebalancing the economic relationship,
true.
on dealing with issues like market access and forced technology
Yep.
transfers. It's a similar conversation carried out by different means in the US-China trade talks. And I think that there are very concrete aspects of this relationship that the West is trying to rebalance,
Right.
but in part it does take place within this broader conversation of authoritarian consolidation within China. It's just, again, from my conversations, it seems to be a part of the concern.
Yeah, okay. Dean Cheng, we spoke about co-governance on the basis of what would a future co-governance be. We talk about China, particularly in the United States, as an existential threat sometimes. And Tori mentioned about, there's this new, if you like, Washington consensus, how, there used to be a really strong pro-China lobby in Washington, and now it seems there is a real bipartisan consensus that China actually threatens not only American interests, but the whole rules-based international system. So how has this come about?
Well, let me push back actually a little bit on your last comment to Tori. Leonard Mary, let me actually first begin by thanking the organizers. This is my first time to the Leonard Mary conference, my first time to Estonia. It is absolutely an honor to be here, and so I take my life into my own hands by quoting President Mary, by noting that he once observed that our civilization has lost this bond between times and tends to measure time with a yardstick, bit by bit, from one point to another. And I think that part of the reason why there has been this growing sense of China as a broad problem is that there is this effort to go beyond individual point-by-point problems to the larger context of what is the frame of US-China competition.
Okay.
And again, this conference is organized around the idea of one past, many futures. And what is striking is that we assume that there is only one past. But in fact, between the US and Europe on the one side and China on the other, we have very different pasts. Europe produced a rule of law approach to internal governance and international organization, international behavior, and the US is part of that tradition. China has historically always had rule by law or rule through law. The law exists to further predetermined political ends. Europe is a balance of power region. And we heard that in the very first panel and through many of the other panels, Russia being another power that had to be balanced. But Europe, of course, had England, Spain, Austria, Prussia. Asia never had balance of power relations. It was always the middle kingdom or the central kingdom and tributary states, a very different mental model for international relations. And when you pair those two together, rule by law around a central dominant hegemon, you have a very different view of whether or not international relations is truly among equals, where small and mid and large powers are all ruled by the same set of concerns, or as Chinese Foreign Minister Yang Jiechi said in 2011, there are big countries and there are small countries, and each should know their place. That is a very different model. And so I think that Washington has been looking at this evolving Chinese approach, especially as China's power has grown, as now the second largest GDP in the world, and is, frankly, looking at it with more than a little alarm. The issue of concrete problems, for example, intellectual property, this has been the real focus. If you take a look at the Trump administration's actions on China in the ongoing trade war, the administration came in talking about trade deficit and currency manipulation. But the USTR letter in November hiking tariffs was specific about 4 points: joint ventures, licensing requirements, regulatory obstacles, and cyber economic espionage, all of which had to do with intellectual property. And again, that goes to the fundamental concept: is the international system going to be governed by rules about intellectual property and respect thereof? Or is it going to be a system where one can engage in cyber economic espionage, which has the difficulty, of course, of attribution? And so here, what it really comes down to then, ironically, is that the US and China confront each other as great powers, both thinking of themselves as status quo powers. Yes. The problem is, whose status quo? Yeah. The American status quo, which is about 250 years and grounded in rule of law, or the Chinese 5,000-year-old status quo, which always had China as a dominant power.
Excellent, Dean. You talk about rule of law versus rule by law. You also mentioned Yang Jiechi's comment about there are big countries and small countries. But the biggest country, the biggest power by any dimension of power today is the United States. And people would look at the United States and say, rule of law under the Trump administration, under the Bush administration, just even under Trump, we've had US trashing the Paris Climate Change Agreement, trashing the JCPOA with Iran, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, withdrawal from INF. So someone coming from Mars might say, rule of law? What rule of law? The only rule here is the rule of power. And so the United States has gone from, if you like, being the global promoter, protector of international norms and institutions to, well, stuff everyone else. This is a realpolitik world. So people say, what rule of law? How do you answer that?
Well, let me begin by noting that I do not work for this administration.
Point taken. And I never suggested that you did either. So.
And coming from Washington does not make me, therefore, a spokesman for the administration.
I totally understand.
But I would say to our Martian interlocutor, first, welcome to Earth. But second of all, is to note here that, on the one hand, yes, the U.S. has withdrawn from a number of agreements. But at the same time, the U.S. has actually stepped up to new agreements. The US-Mexico-Canada trade agreement, for all intents and purposes, is NAFTA 2.0, which is kind of amusing considering that if there was one thing that candidate Trump truly hated with the passion of 10,000 supernovas, it was NAFTA. And yet here he is, prepared to go to the mat with Nancy Pelosi to get this treaty through. Yeah. With regards to TPP, I think that was a great misfortune on the American part. But let me note here that both candidate Trump and candidate Clinton were very insistent that neither would push TPP. And to be fair, President Obama demonstrated with Obamacare, the Affordable Care Act, when he cared about something, he would push every button, shake every hand, and break every spine to make it happen. He did none of that for TPP. The real problem there, and this goes to your question, is that America no longer seems 100% behind free trade. And that is very, very worrisome. And that is a bipartisan issue that, unfortunately, if it was just a Trump issue, would presumably pass after the Trump presidency. But here, I fear we are looking at a longer-term, more systemic problem.
Because I wonder whether it's not just about free trade, it's about who decides the rules and who abides by the rules. And some people would say, well, you know, they look at American exceptionalism. The Russians and Chinese look at American exceptionalism and say, well, if they can be exceptionalist, why can't we too? And that'd be my question to you. I mean,
Well,
you know, aren't we just encouraging a whole series of exceptionalisms, which ultimately is based on power, not rules? If you can, you will.
If we believe that President Obama and President Clinton were more in support of the international order, do we see a Moscow and a Beijing that somehow curbed their actions? Let me note here that China's construction of islands in the South China Sea, a blatant violation of the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, which China has signed,
Yeah.
all right, occurred not under President Trump, who ignores international law, but under President Obama, he who signed up to COP21.
Yeah. Fair point. Teresa, sitting in Brussels as you do you get the sense that European or EU relations with China are going the same way as US-China relations? In other words, a solid, highly critical consensus of China, or do you still think there's time and opportunity to row that back?
Okay, well, thank you. First of all, I want to thank Leonard Mary. I participated last year, and it was such an honor to be here, and I'm delighted to be back. People might hear my accent, and they always want to know where you're from, especially when you talk on issues related to China. So my father's Irish, my mother's American, I'm married to an Italian, my kids grew up in Russia and China, and I live in Brussels. So you decide which box you want to put me in. So I think the best, and at the dinner on Friday night, the president had the submarine behind her, and she used that as a metaphor in her speech. And I think that also applies to China. I mean, the best strategy China ever pulled was to convince the Europeans that China had no strategy. So now we're starting to see the submarine come up, and everyone's wondering, oh my gosh, is it too late? So, and the title of this is China and the West Playing Chess and Checkers. And I talked to some people in DC, and they described it as a game that's constantly changing, creating a new chess pieces, and there are so many pawns in this game. Is three-dimensional chess with Belt and Road Initiative, and this game just continues to grow more complex. So it is tough. I mean, we're just beginning to diagnose the problem, and it's difficult to even come up with how to solve it. So what is Xi Jinping's grand strategy? He just wants to make China great again. I mean, that's part of the China dream. He wants to make China great. What keeps him up at night, I would say, is a fear of not being able to escape the middle income trap. He's trying to avoid chaos. He needs to continue to produce prosperity. And he wants China to be central in the international system. In my view, the People's Republic of China will be a revisionist state, not a revolutionary one, and it's kind of slowly nibbling around the margins of the system. So as I'm the fourth speaker, I will change the question around a little. Why did Xi play his hand too soon? This is, they were doing so well, kind of quietly, saying everything's business, don't worry about us investing in your ports, don't worry about all these things. So what pushed him to move from Deng Xiaoping's hide and bide strategy to kind of Belt and Road, we're here everybody, and that created a pushback. It put China on the international stage, and when you do that, there is pushback, and everyone's starting to pay attention. So inside China, many academics complain about Xi Jinping's mishandling of the relationship with the United States, and that he overplayed his hand, he miscalculated. And my question is, was it a tanking Chinese economy? They know more about their economy, and no economist worth his salt trusts PRC figures. So is the economy, have we reached peak China? And they're pushing to finally make their way because they realize that they might not have the finances to do it. I'm sorry? Oh, okay. There's internal discord. They assumed that the U.S. was in irreversible decline, but the U.S. has shown some resilience, and President Trump is such an uncertain leader that the Chinese really are finding it difficult to deal with him. What about Xi's personal health issues? He's gotten rid of the replacement system. There's no heir selected, so this actually creates a lot of uncertainty in the system, as no new future leader is being groomed. And his removal of term limits has angered many people inside and outside of China. So the question is, was Xi too ambitious too soon? And now this has given the West some time, much needed time to respond. So we see almost now in Europe a war going on with 5G. And maybe things wouldn't have hit the fan, but they have. So now we see how much influence and, for example, the House of Lords, half of them have admitted they have some tie to Huawei. So there's been a form of elite capture. And I know I'm in Europe because wherever I go, there's a giant poster for Huawei. If you go to the airport in the US, you don't see anything about Huawei. So it's really made Beijing's propaganda efforts very difficult because there really is concern about IPR theft. European trade negotiators really want to see concrete change. They're getting harder. And I mean, they look at Donald Trump and think, oh, he's got sharp elbows. But secretly, they really are glad about what he's doing because in one sense, they would love to do it. And they think they can free ride on the benefits of trying to reform China's IPR theft and these issues of reciprocity. So quietly, they watch and they hope that it will change. But when it appears that there might be managed trade, that's when the Europeans really get upset. But one of the biggest problems, I mentioned Huawei and 5G, I mean, we really have to worry about digital authoritarianism. We've never been confronted with such a huge threat to all of us. It's the most frightening aspect of the Leninist one-party state. I mean, we've seen experiments in Xinjiang, facial recognition. If you do something naughty, you can't buy tickets to get on a plane, a train, or automobile. So it's really worrisome. And what will this do to society? I mean, I have teenage boys. They make mistakes all the time. But if you make a mistake and cross, jaywalk or something like that, your face is on the screen and you're punished. If your friends go to a protest, you're punished. You get a lower social credit score. So what does that mean? We already see. We always think that's just in China, but who was the first person who got fired for liking a tweet that said something about Tibet? I mean, Marriott hotel industry hired someone to do their social media. Maybe they didn't have a degree in international relations, but they mistakenly liked a tweet about Tibet and lost their job. So it reaches to all of us, and it might get worse with the introduction of 5G.
Teresa, I wanted to just come in a bit. You're sort of suggesting that it's a bit of a myth that China doesn't have a strategy, but yet you also asked the question of why did Xi Jinping show his hand so soon, so early? And I wondered whether, this idea that, Europeans, Russians think only about the short term and China thinks in terms of 100 years, 1,000 years. Actually, that's a big myth. That they make policy on the go, that there's a randomness, there's a screw-up factor. And, we see this in the Belt and Road Initiative, this kind of the learning experience that young Cheng was talking about. So they kind of improvise. A lot of Chinese policy is not actually that strategic. It's actually ad hoc, reactive, opportunistic. I wonder, would you like to comment on that?
I think the Belt and Road Initiative is a great example because it kind of says this is the direction that we want to go. And then China's a big country, so small regional groups figure out how to do it. And some fail and some do well. Yeah. And so the Chinese are always getting these feedback loops. So they look at the mistakes that they've made, and they've really admitted that there's been a huge misallocation of resources along the Belt and Road Initiative. Early on, if you said you had a Belt and Road project, you got loads of money. Later, those bankers were not allowed to leave China because they just spent the money so badly. So this idea that, everyone understands you cannot have such a tight grand strategy because the world is constantly changing and moving. Mm-hmm. But the idea of knowing which direction they want to go, I think is very important. And I think it's incredible if you think about it. So Xi Jinping made the announcement in Kazakhstan about the land, the Eurasian land bridge. And then he went to Indonesia and talked about the maritime Silk Road. And then we talk about the polar Silk Road, the Arctic North. So that's bringing it very, very close to Europe. Then we hear about the space Silk Road, and then we hear about the digital Silk Road. Can you imagine if Xi Jinping said all of those things in one speech in Kazakhstan? Everyone would have been so terrified. So I think that the Chinese have been they know what they want, but they just kind of feed it to us slowly, because otherwise it would just be so overwhelming. But I think what we really have to pay attention to is how they're changing the norms and the international codes, because we see, do we want to have, a free internet, or are we going to see this digital, Great Wall of China, the Great Firewall of China? This is a huge question for all of us, because the idea of the internet originally, just like when China joined the WTO in 2000, we thought if they join the WTO and we hug them close enough to us, they'll become a democracy and capitalists and everything will be unicorns and rainbows. But it hasn't worked out that way. And we see that instead of them changing, they're actually changing the West more. They're changing our norms. They're nibbling away. For example, the World Bank actually has to change the way their loans are made because they can't compete with Chinese funds. So they're actually reducing some of the norms that everyone has worked so hard to establish. So China cannot be ignored, but if we're just so weak, we're not going to be able to, they're changing us more than we're changing them.
But isn't that our problem? That we need to fix ourselves. It's all very well, we're right to criticize China over the state of the Uyghurs in Xinjiang, over the treatment of human rights dissidents, for their unfair trade practices. We should criticize them for all those things and more. But isn't really, fundamentally, the problem of China is actually a problem about ourselves?
Well, I would say that the West has gotten very flabby, and we need to get back in shape and wake up. I mean, after that hubristic, when the US was the one power in the world, I think they really got out of shape. So I think that this idea that everybody needs to, I'm a middle-aged woman too, I understand. So we have to really, wake up. And what are our values? As the first day, the first panel, do we believe in these values? We see with the EU global strategy, they talk about principled pragmatism. So that means that, values are something you can interpret the way you want. And you can be principled sometimes and pragmatic the other time. Okay. But the other issue is for Europe, because you did ask me earlier on about Europe. Yeah. Europe has no consensus on China. And this is a huge issue because Europe is actually neutralized now. They cannot speak with one voice. So you have these kind of what I call coalitions of the willing. You see French ships go to the South China Sea and they put a couple of Europeans on it who remain silent and don't want anyone to know. But we were talking about this at lunch and someone told me that's a very European way. The French send the ship, but they don't tell anybody. Then the Americans tell them later. And then the French got disinvited to the PLA big 70-year birthday party. So we're seeing the European dream coming in collision with the China dream. So which one will survive? And I think that China has a strategy, whereas the Europeans are kind of more in crisis right now. And I think that they really do.
Yeah, fair enough. No, that's very insightful. Thank you. I'm going to open it out to you in the audience. 2 rules. One, can you please introduce yourself? And the second, please, 1-part questions and interventions. Kostya, why don't you go first? Just in the second row there.
Yes, good morning. Konstantin Egat, Russian national working for Deutsche Welle in Vilnius. My question is actually to Dean. As Russia is actually the only major country that could ostensibly have a major war with China and has a 4,000-kilometer border. How it is viewed now in Washington? I know you don't work for the administration, but you have a better idea than I. How it is viewed in this whole, US-China conundrum now? Is it viewed as irrelevant? Is it viewed as a Chinese ally? Is it viewed as a country that may fall under Chinese sway eventually? Is it viewed as a nation that has to be lured on the, say, US side in this major confrontation, which probably will not go away with Donald Trump? Thank you very much. Okay. And by the way, if Teresa wants to comment on that.
Okay.
Agnew, you're on.
Anya Grigas, Atlantic Council. I wanted to ask the panel if you could highlight how you think the democratic powers are vulnerable in face of rising, not just rising China, but as you highlighted, a rising authoritarian China. Thank you.
Andrew.
Thank you very much, Andrew Mick. Terrific panel. I have a question about the longer-term impact of what we're seeing, and that's to anybody on the panel. But in particular, Tori said something that touched a button here. that we are, in a sense, responding to something that's happening internally, that we're having this breakdown over manufacturing and other issues. We can't provide the standard of living. I would submit this is actually interconnected and connected to what's been happening with our Chinese friends. So I would push back against this segmenting a bit and ask a question. So, because I share Teresa's view that there is a strategy no matter how many correctives you can go through. What's the end game? I hear from a lot of European, especially senior German business people, concern over us being changed, concerned about what this means long term, and hence, are we looking at an ideological contest going downhill, unlike anything we've seen so far, not even with the Soviets? Thank you.
Yeah. I mean, just picking up on that, Teresa, you did say something about, well, what does China want? What does Xi Jinping want? He wants China to be great again. I have no idea what that means, so I'm hoping that you can unpack that for me. Ed Lucas.
Thanks very much. Edward Lucas from SEPA. What worries me is that we are losing on what should be the easiest bit, which is our own ability to discuss this. And I'd be interested in the panel's thoughts on the way in which the Chinese Communist Party, through United Front Work Department and other means, is controlling the discourse in the West. It's really difficult now to talk about Tibet and about Taiwan, about Falun Gong, about human rights, in a range of places where this was completely unconstrained before. Just inviting a Tibetan leader to a university invites severe economic sanctions on that university from the Chinese authorities, and universities cave. It's difficult to get research money, there's all sorts of things. And so even on this kind of low-hanging fruit of symbolic pressure, like why can't we send defense attaches to Taiwan? Why can't we invite Taiwanese diplomats to our meetings? We don't. Tomorrow, World Health Assembly in Geneva, Taiwan will be excluded because of Chinese pressure. This should be so easy for us. And every Western country is against this. No one is willing to confront the Chinese.
But again, Ed, that comes back to the point of solidarity, and that is really fundamentally, is that not our problem, that we won't push back as a unified
Europe?
But
there is an organised Chinese attempt to exploit this. And,
absolutely.
And this is the sharpest point of the spear, I think, is can we discuss what we want to discuss in our own universities? And, and it's very interesting to compare Russia and China. You can't imagine Russia being able to exert weaponizing its diaspora, weaponizing its money in order to control discourse about Russia. It's almost unimaginable they would even try.
Fair point.
China does it, and we think this is completely normal, and then we cave.
Oliver.
Hi, Oliver Bullough. I'm used to looking at things through the prism of kleptocracy, and we're quite used to thinking when we talk about Russia that we don't just think about the Russian government representing Russia's interests, but they're also representing their own personal pecuniary interests when they act. To what extent should we be thinking about the Russian elite in terms of their own personal...
Chinese elite.
Big night last night. The Chinese government, you know what I mean, the Chinese elite's personal financial interests in the way that they can personally exploit the situation. Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to turn it to the panel. Yang Cheng, why don't you pick up some of those questions?
Well, I think it's quite difficult for me to, go beyond my knowledge because I'm an expert on the Russian Eurasian affairs. I can understand the internal logic of Chinese development, but to some very special question about personal, financial, I don't know. I have no idea, but about the question about the it's called the discourse about the debate about the Xinjiang, about Falun Gong and so on. I mean, this is a confrontation or about the. So China perceived it as sovereignty issues, and it's like Deng Xiaoping when he discussed with the UK Prime Minister in the 1980s that, for example, Hong Kong issues is not it cannot be discussed. That's the sovereignty issues. So personally, I think that to some extent, for example, Falun Gong. When I worked at the embassy of Chinese embassy in Moscow, the first report I wrote for Peking and to say that it's about Falun Gong because when Jiang Zemin made a trip to Moscow. Also, there is a lot of Falun Gong activists, not only in Russia but from abroad, from the Europe, from the United States, to collect there and to raise the protest. And at the time, we think that it's a quite big trouble, big problem, and we would like to ask Russian authorities to cooperate with us to make it not so clear for the leadership, for the Chinese president, right? But I think within many years passed, and nowadays, exactly who knows the Falun Gong? I mean, it is in decline. So to some extent, I think that at that time, China's behavior is a little bit overreacted to the outside world. And I think that today, even personally, I think that, for example, when you said that China is used to their, instrument to give pressure and to stop talking about this kind of issues, I think also, for me, I think it's a little bit a mistake. Like someone from the audience or from our panelists said that, for example, when Yang Jiechi said, you are big powers, we are big powers, you are small states, I think it's a mistake in the process. So this is why I always emphasize that China is in a learning process. We don't know exactly how to interpret our interests, and we are not clear about the future of ourselves and also about the regional power and about. So that means you should not also react to China's some narrative or discourse. You should know that there should be some double adaptation or double accommodation from both sides, and I think that it takes time for China to become a more normal. And even I think it is a myth that, for example, I'm afraid I have to disagree with some statements by Dean Cheng about the Middle Kingdom. It's a myth. Today's China is more modernized than before. And if you ask Chinese students or any Chinese, do you know some Confucian, maybe several sentences they can tell you, but the whole, the 论语. I think many of Chinese haven't read totally from the beginning to the end. So that means China is become more pluralistic and become more modernized, and it's even to some extent become more westernized.
But you talk about more westernized, a process of mutual adaptation. But a lot of Western criticisms of China on the basis, yes, of course, China is still learning many things, it's still adapting, still coming to grips with many contemporary challenges. But on the other hand, it's much more authoritarian now than it was, say, 10 years ago. So in other words, there's a learning experience, but maybe a different kind of. There's an authoritarian learning experience rather than a democratic, liberalizing learning experience. You mentioned Falun Gong. Yes, Falun Gong isn't such an issue today, but the reported incarceration of 1 million Uyghurs in Xinjiang is a big-time issue. So how do you address criticisms that, in fact, China, it's not just China's learning, China's actually unlearning. So how do you address criticisms like that? What could the Chinese government do to, in a sense, project a better image to, in a way, satisfy some of these concerns?
I agree with you totally. I mean, I traveled a lot for example, to Central Asia and to Russia, and especially to Central Asia, to Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan several recent years. And many questions raised up related to the Xinjiang problem, and they were seriously worrying about the so-called cross-border, transnational ethnic groups, means Kazakhs or Kyrgyz in China. I think that's also, personally, I think that there's some mistake about the interpretation of China's behavior, because there is no any for about I think 1 or 1.5 years. I mean, there's no any interpretation or explanation about China's behavior in Xinjiang. Okay. Why you need so many so-called re-educated so-called schools, and I think it's also because China's authorities is more, how to say, is not so familiar with the international audience. I mean, they don't know how to. And they think that it's sovereignty issues. Yes, really, it is sovereignty issues, but you should take into consideration the reaction of the outsiders. Okay. Right. So, I mean, when the Xinjiang government or Chinese government released their, official document about the Xinjiang issue, I think, and started inviting the foreign ambassadors and also journalists to go to visit Xinjiang, I think things became more clear than before. Okay. It's better than without any explanation at the beginning.
Okay, I'm going to move to Tori now.
I want to pick up on one question about the Russia-China cooperation. I know this was pointed toward Dean, but it's an issue I've been looking at. And in Washington, from what I can tell, this is becoming an increasing concern. When the Director of National Intelligence testified in front of Congress a few months ago, this was an area that he brought up, and it was the first time that this was brought up from the DNI, this Russia-China cooperation. From my point of view, that this is a big issue of perception as well. So we've had this operating assumption on Russian and Chinese cooperation for a long time now that said there's a lot of underlying mistrust between the two. There aren't many reasons to cooperate. It's not in either's national interest to develop, or kind of tradition, to develop a strategic partnership and alliance, and I agree with that. But we can also look over the last 2 years at enhanced cooperation in trade, joint military exercises, very close relations between Putin and Xi. And I think even if we aren't to see any sort of enhance cooperation between the two on a tactical level, if there were to ever be confrontation between the US or China, I don't think we're likely to see Russia step in. But it gives confidence to both Putin and Xi that they can carry out more assertive actions with less blowback from one another. It gives the sense that they have a partner that they won't receive this sort of pushback from. And I think it's also important to take into account that this closening relationship is happening at a time of significant Western disunity. And this was most apparent last summer. We had the G7 meeting, and there's this famous picture now of Merkel glaring down on Trump when they're talking about tariffs, and everyone else is looking on despondingly. And then I think it was a week later, Putin and Xi were meeting, and Xi Jinping was teaching Putin how to make Chinese dumplings. And I had this image of, what if Merkel and Trump were to take a cooking class together? We would never think of that. And so the fact that you have this enhanced cooperation at a time of Western disunity, again, just strikes this geopolitical shift in power that even if we're not seeing it play out on a day-to-day basis, we may not see it play out in tactical and military cooperation. It changes the sense of confidence and assertion behind these. And perceptions matter in international politics.
Absolutely.
I also want to pick up on the political influence question. I completely agree. This is an area where it should be very clear to shine a light on and push back, especially when it comes to influence in academic institutions, in Western publishers. We've seen examples of this in Australia, in Europe. And part of the reason why I don't think we see enough transatlantic cooperation on this now is because the political influence conversation in Washington has been so dominated by Russia for these last few years for political reasons and whatnot. But when you have this conversation of authoritarian influence, right now it's centered on Russia. I mean, I think we're seeing a shift to focusing on different types of Chinese influence, interference. But in the United States and in Europe, a lot of this influence is also legal. And so we're seeing a response from Europeans in particular to address some of the kind of foreign investments in critical industries, investments that were allowed prior, but that gave the Chinese a lot of political influence in these societies. We're starting to see a pushback there. But full circle, I do think that this is an area for transatlantic cooperation, sharing best practices between cultural institutions, academic institutions, and this should be an area for increased cooperation. I think we're starting to see a change from that in Washington too.
Okay, great. Thank you. Dean.
So, several quick points. One, China's strategy. And I very much agree that there isn't an actual NSC 68 with Chinese characteristics, nice document to look at. But I do think the Chinese have a conception of security, which looks very much like a Russian Matryoshka doll. And at its core is traditional 19th century concepts of sovereignty. And in that regard, therefore, I would actually disagree respectfully with Teresa. I don't think China is revisionist. I think China is revanchist. I think China, the closest analogy I would have, please let me note here, my focus is China and Asia, not Europe. But my analogy would be to post-1870 France. A China that is intent upon reclaiming lost territories, namely Taiwan, and resecuring past borders like the South China Sea, and reestablishing itself with glory, with tradition, with all of those aspects. Farther and farther from China, the issues are less and less military and more political. And the thing is that at the global level, where we see issues of dissent, issues of academic freedom, it is political warfare, not military warfare. But for the Chinese, political warfare is the hardest form of soft power. And it is pursued with the same kind of focus and all-arms aspect that traditional military operations are, in part because political warfare is partly the responsibility of the political work department of the People's Liberation Army, including the so-called three warfares of legal warfare, public opinion warfare, which includes shaping people through things like the Confucius Institutes, targeted investment, et cetera, as well as psychological warfare. Just very briefly on the Russia aspect, two responses. One is Washington and the other is my own. Washington is bipolar. And bipolar, I don't mean two major centers. I mean wild swings from one end to the other. So on Mondays and Wednesdays and Fridays, what we are confronted with is the Sino-Soviet alliance of circa 1956. Yeah. The two are going to basically have combined forces. Vostok 18 is presaging some next iteration. And some folks even talk about the Shanghai Cooperation Organization as some nascent NATO, Russo-Chinese, although that seems to be parroting both Beijing and Moscow. On Tuesdays, Thursdays, and Saturdays, on the other hand, there's great confidence. China, Russia, they hate each other, they will never trust each other, et cetera. Myself, personally, I think that the best way to think about Russia and China is mutual antipathies, but few shared sympathies. They both dislike the United States. They both are leery of the West. They are authoritarian. They question the possibility of regime change, which unfortunately Washington has talked about, and they assume that it applies to them. Yeah. But if the U.S. were to disappear from Central Asia, the U.S. were to mute itself, I do think there are underlying problems between these two authoritarian governments, both of which have long historical reasons to dislike and distrust each other.
But if you're talking about China being a revanchist power, how far does that revanchism go? Would it, in the scenario that you're talking about right at the end there, see maybe a bid to reacquire the so-called lost 1.5 square million kilometers, namely the Russian Far East?
So, two responses to that. First off, I think the Chinese are smarter than the Americans, one war at a time. And right now they're engaged in a political conflict. Yeah. But if we look at how willing China has been to send military units across the Indian border, and I'm not talking about 1962, I am talking about within the last 4 years. Yeah. So we are talking about a nuclear-armed India, because China believes that Arunachal Pradesh is actually South Tibet, that the line of actual control is illegitimate, then if I were on the Russian general staff, I would always have a folder, perhaps in Manchurian yellow or whatever colors they categorize them as, sort of keeping an eye out on their neighbor to the east. Not because I think the Chinese are about to send an armored division or 6 across the border, but because in the longer term, it is not clear what the final disposition of those borders are going to be, even with the Gorbachev-Deng Xiaoping agreements of the 1980s.
Yes.
Okay, I'd like to just respond, because respectfully, the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, the EU is actually a signatory to that document. And 93% of world trade is done by sea. So by sea. So this is so important. And China has interpreted it under their own one rule for us and another rule for the rest of the world. And this is very serious, and it's of great concern, because especially here in Europe with the Arctic, how will China interpret the law? So we saw recently with a Colonel Zhou, who spoke at King's College in London. And someone from the audience asked him, he said, your ship came through British waters in order to do this military exercise with the Russians, and we allowed you to do that. Can you comment on that? Because you're against this type of behavior in your near seas. And the colonel responded, see, we follow British rules in British waters, and you need to follow Chinese rules in Chinese waters. So I think that if that's really a serious sign of how China interprets international law, I think we're in serious trouble. So I think that's why I would say that they're revisionist. Yeah. So in regard to making China great again, I'm aware of the time, I'll just keep it brief. To make the world safe for one Leninist party. Okay. That's his whole goal.
Right. Okay.
And then let me add, how many of you have heard about United Front? Just a show of hands. Okay, this is spooky. You should know about this because there is testimony online, March 16th, Peter Mattis, brilliant. You should take a look at it. It's short, great read. This is, as Dean was talking about, how political warfare, it is a department and it has kind of Soviet seeds, kernels of the Soviets started all this, but the Chinese have perfected it and enhanced it. And Confucius Institutes, all these cultural centers, this is a huge plan. There's lots and lots of money poured into this, so you should pay attention to it. The Juncker Commission wanted to have transparency. They haven't done it. We don't know who's lobbying who. We don't know how the Chinese are influencing everybody. I hope that the next commission will introduce transparency issues because, at least in the US, the think tanks have to advertise who's paying for these opinions. Okay. And one last thing, Ursula von der Leyen, she mentioned the growing islands in the South China Sea, which I found incredible because what people forget about is that it was German dredgers that were rented to help build them. So this idea of strengthening China and making money out of them kind of reminds me of the quote from Lenin about the capitalists selling the rope that will hang themselves. Yeah. So we saw KUKA. So the KUKA cell, I think, was a turning point for Germany. It's a very advanced robotics company. And the most important thing about that is not just the robotics, but the people who work there, the German engineers. Well, it's Sunday, they're probably not working today. But tomorrow, they will be going back to work and designing advanced robotics for the People's Liberation Army. Exactly. Now, this creates tensions in the transatlantic relationship. So I really think that we need to think hard how European industries are strengthening a rival in the Pacific.
That's an excellent point, Teresa. Okay, very good. Okay, right, so we have a whole bunch of people. Lady in the front first, just front row there.
Thank you. Ulrike Franke from the European Council on Foreign Relations. I wanted to drill down on a few things that Teresa alluded to. It is one thing. So in my mind, for Europe, the most important question at the moment really is there a Western view, as the panel's title suggests, of China's rise, and thus can there be a Western approach to China? Because it seems to me that it is much clearer what the US thinks about China strategically than Europe. So for the panel, what would you say? What are the strategic interests of Europe with regard to China's rise, and how do they differ from the US's strategic interests with regard to China's rise? Thank you.
Okay, great. Maria.
Maria Logan, Open Russia. So just a quick follow-up on Russia and China cooperation. So recent reports show that Russia or certain non-state actors are increasing their footprint in Africa. China is also in Africa, and it's unclear as to what is the level of cooperation of Russia or those non-state actors like Prigozhin and his empire are doing together in Africa.
The lady third row.
Guo Chunju from China's Xinhua News Agency. My question is, how do you think of the role of China proposed Belt and Road Initiative to enhance international cooperation and jointly build a community of shared future for mankind, combining with the host country's own development action plan? And how do you think of the peaceful rising of China will offer a window of opportunity for both American dream and the Chinese dream, because the common ground is better life for everyone. Thank you.
Thank you. Gentleman in the front row, Ambassador.
I just asked for the floor when I heard Mr. Cheng say that it would be advisable, things would become clearer if Western ambassadors could visit Xinjiang. I'm a Western ambassador. I visited Xinjiang in 2014. It became very clear to me what is happening there, and it has become clearer still since that time.
Okay. The lady with her hand up there.
Thank you. Rina Kionka. I work for European Council President Donald Tusk. Follow on to the question over there about Chinese foreign policy, Chinese and American foreign policy. In fact, during the Cold War, there were proxy wars between the US and Russia in various parts of the world. Now we're seeing the same sort of thing possibly happening with China and the United States. I'm thinking about the conversation we had last night over the Western Balkans in the panel. Also the new US strategy toward Africa seems to be another expression actually of its China strategy. So your comments, please.
Okay. The lady just in fourth row there, just over here.
I'm Harinder Sekhon from the Vivekanand International Foundation in New Delhi. And my question is to Professor Yang Cheng, who mentioned about sovereignty issues and that everyone should be double accommodating about Chinese concerns about sovereignty issues. What I'd like to ask is, would those concerns and accommodation extend to India, which has genuine concerns about the China-Pakistan economic corridor, which passes through disputed Indian territory and is a major part of your BRI? So would that spirit of accommodation extend to other countries as well, or is it specific only to China? And second, Dean has already touched upon Arunachal. If you could further elucidate on that.
Okay,
Thank
great.
you.
Great question. Can you bring it to Shota at the back, just over?
Yeah, hello. So China is becoming increasingly visible in the Eastern Partnership, and we have seen China very actively engaged in Belarus, and it has raised some questions in Moscow already, and China has signed the free trade agreement with tiny Georgia. So what is the logic of China becoming more active in this region? Is China going to Europe's neighborhood, or is China going to Russia's neighborhood? What's your take on this?
Okay. Alan, Pavel, and then Pavel first. Yeah, sorry, my mistake.
Sorry about that.
I've jumped the gun.
My question is to Yang Cheng. Well, speaking to the mic. You've mentioned how China views the world order and how it is learning. And I'm wondering how China is viewing the role of military power in the world order. And what is China learning in this regard?
Okay, Alan.
Alan Riley, Atlantic Council, and this is probably principally towards Teresa. We've now, one of the questions is, of course, how does the European Union respond to all of these range of threats? Some things have already happened. On the 10th of April, the EU adopted its foreign investment screening regulation. Now it'll fall into force in October 2020. So that's one measure. I think you see potential real cooperation between the EU and the US on kind of foreign investment matters. Well, what else can we do? Do we need, as you say, a lobbying law? Do we need a kind of a broader political influence law at EU level?
Okay. Yeah.
I mean, so what my question is what other measures should we take in addition to the foreign investment screening regulation?
All right.
And as for the agenda for the new Commission?
Fine, great. James. Behind you. James, behind you.
Thank you. James Sher, ICDS. I also have a military question directed mainly to Dean Cheng. What do we not know about, in a military context, the Chinese approach to bluff, about Chinese risk thresholds, pain thresholds, and approach to crisis management that we need to know?
Okay, great question. And finally, the gentleman just to your right there.
Thank you. I'm Mr. Kmirosic from Slovenia, and I just wonder, you talked about status quo, on the international fora, and now we are observing changing from multilateralism into much more multipolar system, and paradoxically, it seems that China is defending multilateralism, while US is slightly fading away from the multilateral. Can you comment, the panel, on this, where we will end up in a bipolar, multipolar world, and where Chinese role will be?
Okay. In reverse order, there are so many questions and interventions, so obviously just pick 2 or 3. Okay. Teresa, let's start with you.
You asked how does the EU see China versus the US? I would say primarily EU sees China through a trade lens, and the US sees it as an existential threat. I'm going to go through these quickly. I am very pessimistic about the European position towards China. The FDI screening mechanism practically did not get through. It was a miracle, as someone quoted me saying, because now the Italians were against it. And so this is toothless, it's not enforceable, but from an EU point of view, at least they have something. Half the EU member states don't even have an FDI screening mechanism, which I find unbelievable. Sweden doesn't have anything. China is investing in ports in Sweden. So we really have to think strategically. The EU says they don't do geopolitics. I think it's time for them to wake up. Let's see. Just to quickly pick up on Russia, since Russia is in the name of the organization I'm with, I had the pleasure of being in Moscow in December for a conference, and I would say there are 3 scenarios from various people that I spoke to, because there's a banquet of ideas. So I'll fry it down to this. So frenemies, friends with benefits, common interests. So it's a nuanced approach. China and Russia don't like NATO and they don't like the EU, but the Chinese position is more nuanced. They like the big market of Europe, but they want to have enough leverage to stop any policies like FDI screening mechanism. So they want to have that type of leverage. So they can call up, Greece or Hungary and say, block this for me. Now Italy or other countries that are growing to the list. Whereas Russia's more like, let it all burn. So the second is elite capture. Stay with China, it is futile to resist. So some people are like, hey, Russia demographics, our economy is the size of Spain, forget it. We don't like the West, let's just work with China. And lastly, this conference had a very interesting RIAC. I know there's a friend here from there. I was shocked by this. So this kind of narrative that Germany is going to be unhinged from Europe, they will work technologically with China, and Russia will be the bridge between those 3. So it's an interesting narrative like this. This would be keeping me awake at night. Russia, China, German, an alliance. All right, this might be a little fringy, but it's the second conference I went to on that subject. And one last comment. The Russian RT had an article saying that 5G will give you cancer. So you can see that the Russians are not on board with China's 5G.
Okay. Dean, China's military capabilities.
So I think one of the fascinating problems between Europe and the United States has been that Europe's focus on China, even now, is largely economically oriented. And so if I wanted to, I have had a chance to visit Europe several times on business and try to talk to European experts on China, and they're almost always ensconced in the Ministry of Trade, Ministry of Finance, and they always want to talk about, well, what can we do to increase trade with China? It's like, sorry, I'm the Paul Mill guy. But that goes to the heart of where is the European view of China as a strategic challenge. And here I would note that finance, to go to the issue of what should Europe be doing more about, one of the things is venture capital. Because we are seeing this in the United States, that what the Chinese have done is they come in and they start investing at the very initial steps. And if it blossoms, they own the patents. And if they don't, it doesn't blossom, well, we do have the world's largest hard currency reserve, so we'll go and sponsor another 100 companies. So that, along with foreign investment screening, is important. And let me also note here that with regards to what do we not know about China, one of the most important areas is deterrence. We think of deterrence, we in the West, as dissuasion. The Chinese term, 威慑, is much better translated as compellence, coercion, and dissuasion. And the fact that the Chinese are prepared to send troops into a neighboring nuclear power in today's world, not 1960, not 1950, suggests that China has a totally different concept of risk, nuclear risk, and deterrence.
Wow, very interesting. Great answer. Tari.
To come to Rika's question on a Western strategy toward China and where we're seeing the greatest differences between the US and Europe, I agree. I think in Europe we still see a primarily trade-focused conversation. It's about rebalancing this relationship, where in the United States, the rhetoric is about decoupling, this notion that we can fundamentally separate our economies in order to pursue national interests. And I mean, China and the US carry out $2 billion of trade a day, and so I don't think decoupling is in the cards, but that's the strategy being pursued. I mean, as a millennial, as one of the younger people on this stage, I do think it's important that we need to talk about cooperation with China on certain issues. It's become a very competitive conversation. In my adult lifetime, the concern of snowpocalypse has been a much bigger issue than nuclear apocalypse. I see US political leadership doing very little on climate change. China is stepping up. It has a long way to go, but it's becoming a leader. I think this is where we need to be pursuing cooperation. Europeans see an important interest in this. I also think the field of development doesn't need to be necessarily competitive. We're seeing new alternatives to BRI come out of the EU with the EU-Asia Connectivity Strategy. We're seeing new notions come out of Washington, this BUILD Act, this private investment for development in the overseas private investment cooperation. They just signed an MOU with Canada to pursue alternative versions of BRI. But what is not to say that we can't create some sort of race to the top in infrastructure? I mean, China is doing a number of important things in Africa. There are tremendous concerns when it comes to ladening these countries with debt, with kind of untransparent terms of negotiation. But if we had greater Western cooperation in which we raised the terms and the quality of infrastructure, I think we could make the developing world into a much better place. I mean, not to sound idealistic, but we can learn from Japan on this. Under Shinzo Abe, Japan launched a $110 billion quality infrastructure initiative that was meant to compete with BRI, but that at times is carried out in cooperation with Chinese companies, and it is lifting the quality of infrastructure in areas where they're operating together. And sorry, to go back to the US approach, so much of this, I think, should be about using this competition to revitalize our own kind of metrics of competition. There's nothing to say that democracies are going to win the future tech race because in the Cold War, the United States was able to outcompete the Soviet Union on arms. I mean, when it comes to authoritarian control and amassing of data, China has a far greater advantage than democratic states in winning this kind of future tech race. And so this should be a call to invest more in our education system, invest more in R&D, bring the brightest and best people to this country. And I see the US moving in exactly the wrong direction in every single one of those. And so this goes back to something I read by Eli Ratner recently, where he said, the United States is pursuing a confrontational strategy with China without being competitive. And I think we need to focus on these competitive aspects of the relationship and boosting these in our own domestic systems.
Oh, that's terrific. Yang Cheng.
Okay, I would like first to go back to the question about political influence of China in the West. I mean, my question is there any double standards? Because Japan can use this, their money to establish some, grants in the United States. Korea can, why China cannot? And also, United States also and European Union, for example, in the 1990s and in the 2000s, they brought two times to establish they gave the grant to the Chinese institutions and research centers for European studies. Also encourage. Is there a lobby? Is there any interest behind all this? So we didn't. We opened our door to the outside. I think that there should be double direction. You all should be also not just to perceive China as a threat. It's too simplified of perception of China, because there are many Chinas. There is no single China.
But it would be so nice, for example, when Xi Jinping gives a speech in the West, it's put on television. When US presidents go to China, it's not even televised in China. So I think it would be great, like you said, both ways.
Yeah. And also, both ways. And also about the status quo power and ruinous power. I think that China is more like a status quo power. If China is not a ruinous power, what is about the United States, today, under the Trump administration? And I think that China, in terms of the Xinjiang problem. I think that, Ambassador, you reached the 2010 year, yes, right?
14.
2014 year, okay. I think things changed a lot. I mean, here, I would like to suggest to you and other representatives of the West to pay more attention to the local knowledge. I mean, we are lacking of the knowledge about the West, and you are also lack of the knowledge about China, about Xinjiang, about periphery regions, about all of the nationalist regions with ethnic national groups. So we should listen to each other and to observe the situation. And you can give your suggestion, and we will try our best to adapt to the new situation and to resolve the problem. So it should be not a monologue; it should be a dialogue. I mean, the thing about the question about India, about yes, right. It's not typical to specific to just to India. We also, from the very beginning, encouraged India to join the BRI, and you don't want. We also first encouraged Japan to join. Japan refused, but now Abe changed the idea, and we will have the third party cooperation in third country. So that will be perfect. It's up to the willingness. China is. We try to do our best to establish a good relationship with India, and about the common neighborhood maybe. So this is why I always emphasize that China's approach is that we are in favor of the so-called open multilateralism. Georgia or Belarus or Russia or other countries entered into the eastern neighborhood. It's not in anyone's sphere of influence. Nowadays, it's open for everyone, and China can cooperate with them, and you can also. So that means maybe we can, through the overlapping institution building, so that the local countries in the region can receive more benefits from this process. And last words, maybe. I think that China, I regard it as a relatively developing country. And also, it's not far from the so-called superpower status. It's supersized power. So this is why you are afraid. In the world, I think, psychologically, I can understand that you are afraid because there is not clear what China wants, because China has no idea. I agree in this way. China, there is no strategy. Bobo also emphasized that there are more reactions than the design from above. So today, many scholars in the West said that there is a reversed, impact response model by Fairbank. But actually, I think that's partly true, partly wrong, because in many cases, China is a reactive power. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm not going to obviously try to summarize this debate, but what I would conclude is that China's role in the world, our relations with China, multidimensional, hugely complex. There's a vast range of issues. And I think we're all at the beginning of a really long process, but I have no idea whether this process is going to turn out for good or for ill. Anyway, I'd like you to join me in thanking our wonderful panelists, Yang Cheng, Tori Tosig, Dean Cheng, and Teresa Fallon.